Looking to buy, sell, or grow your business to position it for a sale? As the owner and managing partner of Sun Acquisitions, Domenic Rinaldi has personally been involved in over 300 M&A transactions. He has seen and done it all, consulting with large and small businesses across a broad range of industries. On M&A Unplugged, he'll interview buyers, sellers, and their advisors about their experiences scaling, selling, and acquiring businesses. On every episode, you will get key learnings, but most importantly, you will be better prepared for your own acquisition or sale. This is M&A Unplugged with your host, Domenic Rinaldi.
M&A Unplugged community, if you're a business owner or buyer and there is real estate attached to your proposed transaction, you will want to listen to today's episode. I am being joined by Tim Allen, who heads up business development with A3 Environmental, a full-service, woman-owned company that provides environmental testing. I loved one of the quotes I came across by the founder, who also happens to be Tim's wife, Elisa Allen. I give peace of mind to banks, business buyers and sellers, and commercial lenders that their investments are safe from environmental risk. Having sold many businesses where environmental testing was required, I have seen the value of a company like A3 can bring to a transaction. Tim, in his own right, is incredibly accomplished, having started an education software company out of college, which he sold 10 years later, and he currently runs a SaaS platform that helps in the labeling of over 33 million books in public libraries. And that's just two of Tim's many pursuits and accomplishments. Tim, welcome to today's episode. I can't believe 33 million books. That's crazy.
Thanks. Yeah, it is a lot. It's kind of shocking to me, but yeah, it was a lot of work, but we got there.
You're a busy guy. So I'm so excited to get into A3 and talk about what you guys do. So why don't we start there and talk about, what A3 offers and what types of environmental issues you're testing for?
So in environmental due diligence, which is probably mainly what your M&A community would be interested in, what we do is we evaluate the risk associated with a piece of property from an environmental standpoint to the lender, to the buyer, so that when they purchase the property, they don't find out that they've got $100,000 worth of leaking underground storage tanks or something along those lines. And there's a review process. And generally people know it as a phase one. So it's like the first step of that discovery process. And there's phases beyond that. But what it involves is a database search for the federal, state, county, and municipal databases for anybody who ever had leaking underground storage tanks, used chemicals on site, transported chemicals, generated chemicals, anything that would be a hazard to either the soil, the air, or the water supply that would be underneath the building, or their surrounding neighbors who might have polluted onto the property that you're looking to purchase.
So Tim, when is phase one report required? And then, what are you typically doing, after it's been ordered?
So they're typically required when a property is changing hands, and generally speaking, they're done by the lending institution, or I should say demanded by the lending institution. We actually have a surprising number of clients that come to us with all cash transactions, which really just means that they're tapping some line of credit somewhere. And the smart ones know enough to get the due diligence done, but plenty of times they'll do all cash transactions and then find out 6 months later when they want to refi into a conventional mortgage that there's a problem with the property and the banks won't lend any money on it. And then they have to fix it before they'll be able to get a loan against the property.
So obviously a bank doesn't require a phase one on every type of property. Give me typical examples of where a phase one is required. And then how long does the process take from start to finish?
Okay, so banks will set their own internal guidelines. That's usually based on dollar amount. If you're borrowing over $500,000, in a lot of cases, maybe it's $1 million. Sometimes it has to do with the type of property. So if it's industrial, automotive, chemical plating facilities are horrible. They'll require it. And then the process is it's pretty darn quick. Usually we have them done in 10 business days. That's 2 weeks, because there's always a due diligence period once you've signed a contract that you have to get your stuff done inside. So we're an industry that's basically designed to go as fast as possible as soon as we're commissioned.
And what's the expertise that's required to actually undertake a phase one report? And how do you know if you're going out to get a company like yours that, they're going to actually be able to do the job they were hired to do?
So the expertise that we have, all our employees are either environmental sciences majors or geologist majors. And then 3 of our senior people are professional geologists. So there's registered with the state of Illinois and surrounding states for that matter. It depends on, like, every state is a little bit different. So you have to register in each of the states. But there are senior quality assurance people. So like Elisa's got 19 years worth of experience and Dave's got 18 years worth of experience, and Morgan, I don't even know how many years like 20 years of experience for Morgan. And then, so the junior people will do the first pass, and then they'll hand it to the senior people who will do the final review, and then we turn them in.
And are there specific certifications that cover this industry?
Yes, there's a certain certification for environmental professional. Engineering firms can do them. Generally, they don't like to, but yeah, it's a specialty, subset specialty.
So you go through the phase one and you do, it sounds like it's pretty extensive. You're doing a lot of research, pulling a lot of different facts from different places to ultimately put this report together. And what are the various outcomes? I'm sure it's good or not good, but are there shades of good or not good? And I'm sorry, I'm sure there are more technical terms than good or not good.
Yeah, so that the term you're looking for is a REC, which is kind of a pun, but it's actually REC, not WRECK. It's a REC,
Uh-huh.
and it stands for Recognized Environmental Concern, REC. So the way the process works is we go through all our databases. We do an on-site survey, so they search around the inside of the property, the outside of the property, for anything that could be a hazard, either past, present, or future to the property. And then they write everything that they've learned up into a report that they go 300 to 500 pages. And if they found something, they try and they try and talk it away, right? So let's suppose they find a stain on the ground. Initially they'll say that's a recognized environmental concern. Is there some reason why it's not a recognized environmental concern? And then the report will be filled with these things like, we found these barrels, but these barrels were properly disposed of, or the barrels were there, but the barrels were empty, and then there was no sign that they used them, yada, yada, yada. So at the end of the day, we've got recs and then responses to those recs until you reach the point where you've got a rec that you can't respond to. And at that moment, you've got basically what they call it. You've got a rec on your phase one. It's a black mark on it. Sometimes that means that you have to go to phase two, which is some sort of analytical testing that can tell with science that the problem is a problem or it is not a problem. So the phase two gives you a black and white answer about the thing that you found and whether or not it really is impacting the property, or impacting the property in a way that is going to cause some sort of financial liability to the property itself.
So let me make sure I have this right. So you do the phase one, and potentially it's all clear. You give the report to the bank, and then the parties are clear to close, at least from an environmental perspective. But if there's a rec on the report, does it automatically result in a phase two? How's the decision making process at that point in time between the bank and the borrower and the landowner?
So a lot of times people think that we put a black mark on something and then it's just done. You can't lend on it. That's not true. What we do is we open people's eyes, and then the bank and their risk department determines whether or not, what the next step is, how far they want to take that. So gas stations, I would say 85 to 90% of them have what would be recognized environmental concerns. But there's actually an entire industry designed to finance gas stations. So those banks, those types of banks that will lend on gas stations have a different risk tolerance than somebody who generally does restaurants. And then you show up to them and you say, hey, finance my gas station. So a lot of where we go after the phase one with a rec depends on the type of lender that you have and the risk tolerances that they have.
So there are no like national guidelines around this. Every bank can make those decisions themselves.
Well, there is one set of national guidelines about that, and that's for small business lending, which I'm certain your clients and your listeners do a lot of. So the federal guidelines that drive the SBA drive very specific, cut and dried, determinate factors for what you have to do when something appears. And at a very high level, dry cleaners, anything automotive, and many things involving industry of sorts. Like if your property is zoned industrial, you're going to be at least concerned. The SBA is going to be concerned about those things. They're far more strict than a private lender would be, and there are automatic phase twos depending on how old some of those facilities are. Dry cleaner specific. For anybody who doesn't know, and you probably, I don't know if you've ever done M&A for dry cleaners. I'm certain it happens. They are very scary to get involved with, especially when they're old.
Yeah, that's not an industry that we typically play in. We might have been involved in one or two very large plant deals, but generally speaking, dry cleaning is not a sector for us. So when you get to these guidelines from the SBA, do you find that the banks generally adopt them because it's just easy for the banks to do that, or will they still have their own guidelines even though the SBA stuff is out there?
It varies from bank to bank in their risk tolerance and when the last time they got burned was, quite honestly, because they do get burned, just like they make bad loans because somebody wasn't creditworthy. They make bad loans because they got bad environmental advice.
And who in the bank is typically making that decision? Like, do they have their own technical people, environmental technical people? I doubt it, right? So is it an underwriter that's making that decision? How does that decision get made at the bank level?
Well, the standards are set by the senior risk officer. Generally speaking, in practice, it's they call them closers. The loan production people hand off a project to a project manager whose job it is to close the loan and bring it all the way to the end. But the guidelines are set by the risk people in a bank.
Understood. So let's say then let's take this to the next step now. So let's say the report comes back and the bank or the borrower are uncomfortable with the phase one report. There's a rec or two on them. What now happens in a phase two? And I'm sure there's lots of scenarios, but generally speaking, at a high level, what's the process there? How long does it take, and what are the potential outcomes?
So you're right. There are many, many different types of phase twos. They're spec custom. The prices are all over the board depending on what contaminants we're looking for. It might be heavy metals. It might be petroleum products. It might be other chemicals such as dry cleaning fluid. And all of those are different scenarios. But by and large, what happens is somebody shows up with a drill rig. By somebody, I mean us. We'll show up with a drill rig and we drill holes in the ground. We sample the soil, and then we go all the way down to groundwater, and we sample the groundwater. And we do this in a pattern around where we think that there'll be a problem. And we take those samples and we send them into a lab, a certified lab that gives us back certified results about what's in the soil. We take that, we turn it into another report, and the report's basically got risk factors of how bad whatever we're looking for is compared to the state regs for the state that you're in. So the regulations from the Environmental Protection Agency for, in our case, the state of Illinois, how do they stack up against the thresholds that they've put together for us? And that tells you how much of an issue this is for whatever you're doing. Now that we have black and white analytics on that, you're done with your phase 2 part, and now it's on to phase 3. What do we do about what we've learned? Sometimes when we punch holes in the ground, we learn that whatever our fear was is unfounded, which is good. It's an expensive way of finding out that you don't need to do further work. And other times when we punch holes in the ground, we find out that the results for whatever's underground is bad, and you have to move on to a phase 3, which is remediation of the problem that's underground.
So is all of the testing ground testing, soil, water? Is there ever air testing that comes into play, or is there any testing that might happen on the structure of the building itself?
There is absolutely air testing. And that's the most recent addition to the environmental phase 1. So they have what they call vapor intrusion, right? So if you've spilled a lot of something in the soil and then somebody covers that with a building, but it's still in the soil, it leaks through the concrete, because people don't realize, but concrete's very porous. So the vapor comes in through the concrete, and then you've got workers in there working 8 hours a day inhaling it, and that's a serious problem. So we actually, part of the phase 2 process is, for situations like what I just described, is to run air quality tests for some chemical that's in the soil that might be of a known concentration that could be impacting health and human safety inside that building. And that there's different levels of that too. I mean, like, depending on the use of the building, is it a daycare? Is it a industrial? I mean, like, whatever the building's current use is, yes, we have to check air quality. There's also lead-based paint, and there's asbestos and mold. Those 3 things are out of scope for your standard phase 1. If you want them, you have to ask for them, and banks typically don't ask for them as part of what they need to lend on. But it's very good to know, especially if your building is older. If the building's older than 1978, you definitely have lead paint. There's a high probability that you have asbestos, and then mold is everywhere, but it all depends on how moist things got. Those are different sectors of the environmental field.
So in those cases, the buyer is going to have to request from the bank separately, or just do it themselves separately for the lead and asbestos. Is that correct?
That is correct. But generally speaking, depending on the use of the building, asbestos is everywhere, lead-based paint is everywhere, mold is everywhere. So you have to have a decent reason to be concerned about those things. If you don't touch them and you don't disturb them, you don't sand lead-based paint, you don't disturb asbestos, it can be fine right where it's at. But it's when you're tearing down walls and moving things around as part of your build out, or tearing down the building in its entirety, then that's a problem.
So, Tim, let's talk about cost. I imagine we're going to work our way back here. When you get to remediation, it could be anything, right? I mean, depending on the severity. We were involved with one about a year ago. It was a pretty small number. It wound up being like 7,500. It was a plating business that you had mentioned, and it was a small cleanup of about 7,500. But I imagine they could go into the tens and hundreds of thousands, and it's hard to know until you get into the project. But for a phase 2 and a phase 1, generally speaking, what are the costs to people related to those phases?
So phase 1, you're looking at roughly $1,900. It depends on the type of facility, the size of the facility, location, a lot of times, because there's travel times, but let's just call it $1,900. For a phase 2, it literally could be anything, depending on the size and the chemicals that you're looking for, things like that. However, the majority of the phase 2s that we do or see range between $4,000 and $11,000. That seems to be like a general zone for pricing on that. And then the phase 3 is the actual remediation part of it. All depends on what you found and how you can best get rid of whatever problem there is, which I know sounds like you're digging holes and it's super expensive. But a lot of times it can be as simple as you found contamination, and that's exactly where you're going to put a parking lot. So you've got what's called an engineered barrier. You put down a parking lot that you were going to have to put down anyway, and you tell the state you will always have a parking lot there, and the state sends you what's called an NFR letter, no further remediation, and then you're done. So they don't have to be super crazy painful, but you said you did a $7,500 plating facility. I've seen $250,000 plating facility remediation.
Wow.
So
Yeah, that's what I would imagine. It depends on the size of the operation, right? And how extensive the contamination might have been, right?
correct.
Yeah. So, I saw on the website somewhere when I was doing a little bit of research on the company, and I think the work you guys do is fabulous. But I saw something around an innocent landowner defense,
Hmm.
and I was fascinated by that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I can. So the phase one is obviously an eye-opening sort of product, right? So when somebody's like in the M&A world, when they're going to purchase a place, they're doing due diligence, right? They're checking on the financials and the customer base and all the due diligence you do when you go to purchase a business. So the phase one's got a component of that. It's the due diligence to see that whatever you're purchasing is clean, right? But once you've done it, and you've done it with a registered company like ourselves, you actually get I like to call it a firewall between yourself and previous uses, right? So there's an insurance component to it as well. So we have errors and emissions insurance. We got $4 million worth of errors and emissions insurance. And essentially, if the Environmental Protection Agency comes to you and says, you have a problem, you hold up your phase one and say, it basically says, I did my due diligence. I checked this out. My environmental company said I was fine. So I am basically off the hook when it comes to cleaning this problem. It's not me, it's the previous owners. If you don't do that, if you don't do a phase one, you purchase the liability that comes with the property along with the building. Think of it as like just another thing you bought when you bought it. You bought the liability. When you get a phase one, right before you close on the property, you have not bought, you've stopped the purchase of that component of it, the liability that goes along with the particular piece of property.
Wow, that's an outstanding piece of information and a key takeaway for the M&A Unplugged community. So you may even wind up with a situation where the bank doesn't require a phase one, and you might look at this and say, you know what, for the $1,000 or $2,000, from the peace of mind that it could give you, maybe you do it, and now you've cut that liability off.
Absolutely. And the thing is that everyone who is in commercial real estate generally get like a 5-year amortized arm, basically, right? So it's a balloon payment after 5 years, because the commercial mortgages just work that way. They want you to come back to the bank, refinance, you get another 5-year. It might be a 25-year amortization, but it's a 5-year balloon payment, right? And you could be changing banks as recently or as soon as 5 years. I mean, you might stay with the same bank, but you might find a different bank for the second time you refinance. And their question is going to be, do you have a phase one, right? So you're sort of on the conveyor belt. If you plan on owning the building for a long time and having a mortgage over the 25 years, if you want to change banks, they're always going to come back to, do you have phase one? And that first bank might not need it, but the second bank will. And if you do it at that point, at the time you're getting your second mortgage, and you find out there's a problem, then they won't lend to you. So now you've got an ending mortgage, right? That one that's coming to maturity, and you don't have the ability to start the next one, and you don't have the money to pay the building off in its entirety. It's like there's a real risk there in the transition.
Yeah, it sounds like just common sense. Get yourself the insurance policy. Do it for 1,000 or 2,000. You might have saved yourselves tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands potentially. So You had explained to me a couple of weeks back when we first started talking about a scenario that you got involved with where a phase one had been done, a report came back, and there was a wreck. And your firm actually got hired, if I understand this right, by the seller. And you were able to come into the equation and actually, I don't want to use the word disqualify, but refute some of the findings in that report and actually make the wreck go away, or at least have the bank's concern go away so that the deal could close. Probably getting some of the facts incorrect here, but can you describe what that scenario was?
Yeah, actually, it was a mergers and acquisitions scenario. It was really interesting too. And since then, we've actually launched a product that we call defensive environmental consulting. So it's basically it's like the defense attorney side of environmental consulting, and then the buyer side would have the prosecuting side, right? So we're the defense. We took a cold call off of our advertisements on the internet, and it was a gentleman who initially didn't want to tell me his name. He didn't want to tell me anything about him. And he was very upset. And he was trying to sell an automotive facility. Think like a Meineke muffler shop type situation, right? And it was up in Minnesota, as a matter of fact. And he was unfortunately very near bankruptcy at the time, and quite literally, he needed to sell this property to be made whole again. And the buying side that was purchasing it from him was a real estate investment trust, and they went to their environmental company, and that environmental company came in and sniffed around, and then basically turned in a phase one that said that they had all sorts of recognized environmental concerns. Now, of course, automotive has concerns, but you don't necessarily, there is no such thing outside of the SBA, the Small Business Administration. There's no such thing as an automatic phase two. It doesn't work that way. So when he called us, he said, is there an automatic phase two? Because they're trying to charge me $11,000 for this phase two. And if I do that, I'm bankrupt. I might as well just, toss the keys back to the bank and walk away. And I said, well, show me what you got. Send the phase one that they sent to you back to us, and I'll see what we can do. So they sent it to us, and our team read it down from top to bottom, and they said, yeah, this is not right. The environmental company that the buyer side had is wrong, and they're wrong on several different points. So we said, schedule a conference call, and we hopped on that conference call, and we talked through what the concerns were for that other environmental company, along with the buyer and the seller. So we were all on the phone, and we hit them point by point and said, this isn't right, this isn't right, this isn't right, and this isn't right. And at the end of the day, they agreed with us that those things aren't right. And so there's some psychology that goes on in this, right? And you have to understand, buyers use all the reports, not just the environmental. They use the appraisal, they use the environmental reports, and they use, I don't know if you're familiar with the property condition assessment, because that's another due diligence report. They use those reports to drive down the costs of things they want to buy. It's a negotiation, right? So you're going to find every problem you possibly can, and you're going to stick it to the seller, and then you're going to try and lean on them to get the best possible deal that you can. Well, if you don't have somebody who's in your corner, it's a bad place to be in, right? Because you can't speak the language, and you've got a professional telling you, you've got a problem. And honestly, the interesting thing is, everyone always knows when they're being, I want to say BS'd, because we'll keep it clean for the kids listening, but they kind of know deep down inside, but they don't have the scientific background to back it up. And we do. And we've got the state regs and the regulations. We've got it all. So that's one reason why environmental companies come back with, I'll call it bad science. Let's just call it what it is. They'll come back with bad science for negotiation. They'll come back with bad science because there's a lot of liability in what we do. So it's easier to say, oh yeah, you've got a problem with this, and we're gonna have to punch some holes in the ground. they're not doing it for you. They're doing it to protect themselves long-term with the liability. So you wind up having transactions where they're punching holes in the ground where they never needed to, just so that the environmental company that did the work can point to it if they ever wind up in court and say, nope, look, we did it all, and they're coming in clean. And honestly, they do it for fraudulent reasons, because if you're the environmental company who finds a problem, chances are you're the environmental company who's going to do the work. So instead of making $1,900 on a phase one, you made $1,900 on a phase one and $11,000 on a phase two, because nobody else around knows any better, right? So we started doing extensively defensive environmental consulting. And honestly, I got to say, it's the most fun thing we do is to go head to head with other environmental companies and use actual science and the regulations to say that's not the case.
Well, I'd like to be in the middle of one of those conversations. Sounds like a great outcome. You really helped that owner of that business get out and not have to maybe claim bankruptcy or liquidate. So that's a fantastic job. And thank you for keeping it clean. Interestingly enough, I just ran into somebody today who told me they're a regular listener to the podcast, and their 13-year-old has actually been listening. I'm like, wow, he's starting them young.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. M&A.
So Tim, let's wrap this up here. If you could please give the M&A Unplugged podcast community all your contact information. And do you work nationally? Maybe talk about the scope of where you work. And it's, great information you shared today. It was really awesome.
Hey, no problem. Yeah. So the company is A3 Environmental, and we are environmental consultants. We work nationally. We have 10 people in Northern Illinois, just outside of Chicago. And we have another 15 in metro districts across the United States. So we'll do phase one, phase two work anywhere that we need to. 19 years in business, woman owned. I think I covered all your questions there.
How would people get in touch with you if they needed to?
Well, direct to my phone is 630-935-4363. And my email is super simple. It's Tim, Tim, at A3E.com.
Tim, thank you again. It was really a pleasure having you.
No problem. Thank you, Domenic.
So M&A Unplugged podcast community, just to quickly recap a few things that Tim brought up today. If you're buying a property, it's so important to make sure that if your property even comes close to needing a phase one on the real estate, go ahead and order it. It's a tremendous insurance policy. And for sellers, we didn't really touch much on this, but I will tell you there's probably a real value to maybe even doing a phase one before you put your property or business and property on the market, so ahead of time if there are going to be issues that pop up. And if there are things that are found in a phase one, something called a recognized environmental concern, it's going to go to a phase two where now they're drilling and boring and doing air quality and researching. And hopefully there's nothing there, because if you have to get to the phase three remediation, you're gonna be in for some dollars potentially. So some great information. Really appreciate having Tim here today. All of the information will be available in the show notes. If you would like to learn more about the process of acquiring or selling a business, please visit our website at sunacquisitions.com, or feel free to reach out to me at drinaldi@sunacquisitions.com. I look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the M&A Unplugged podcast. And until then, please remember that scaling, acquiring, or selling a business takes time, preparation, and the proper knowledge.
Thank you for joining us today on M&A Unplugged. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and recommend it wherever you get your podcasts. If you want more great information on how to scale, acquire, or sell a business, please visit our website at sunacquisitions.com.